Well, good evening and welcome to the week 5 video. I believe it's week 5. I hope everyone is doing reasonably well despite the challenging circumstances. I be interesting to learn and talk to you all next week about what plans Colorado Mountain College has and your campuses for um, the summer and fall, particularly the fall, and also interested in how your students are responding and what you're hearing from them, what their experiences are with um, online learning. I know with many of the programs that Colorado Mountain College offers, it seems difficult to come up with a way of properly instructing and training students in some of the areas, some of the credential programs that you all have. Um, yeah, so it's for me and Shio, we're taking it month by month from now on as to when we may come back into the office. So of course we're still doing the work from home policy, physical distancing through May, and we'll reassess at the beginning of June. Um, so thank you all for all your hard work. I've really enjoyed reading the discussion posts that you all have made and your research proposal, first take at the first sections of the research proposal and article summaries. So good work. You all are very much impressing all of us with the efforts that you're making and the experience and intelligence that you're bringing to this class. Um, so now we're headed into my two favorite weeks of the semester, which is the state policy work and the state politics week. And so for this week, we're focused on the policy questions. And we all had the privilege of reading Lingenfelter's chapter, which true honor to have it published in that edited volume. I felt like the history of U.S. higher education has been written multiple times, but the history of state higher education or the states in higher education, I don't believe it's been written until this chapter. And so it's a significant contribution to the literature. Of course, there are things that are important that have been left out of the chapter. I think it's worthy of a book. There's so many topics that either he touched on lightly or didn't touch on at all because of time and space. But one thing, that is quite unique about U.S. higher education relative to other countries' approaches to higher education is that really outside the U.S. you see two models. One is which is probably the most popular, is a highly centralized. So the central government, national government, controls or governs higher education, right? So it's a very planned system. It's a country, national system. And that's probably the most common approach. And there's real variances in how that's applied and done country to country, but that's at a high level, the most common model. The other is kind of a laissez-faire approach and a very private market approach. So private higher education dominates. And there's little oversight. That's far less common, but it does exist. The US approach is a federalized approach, so it's a state-based approach, and this is grounded in the US Constitution, and where basically any powers not identified in the US higher education, any powers or authorities, is deferred or allocated to the states, right? And so that has clearly been interpreted in the case law and in our approach to governance as placing ultimate authority for education with the states. Um, and so that's, in my opinion, where most of the action is. Most of the money comes from the states. Most of the state policy action comes from the states. And there was a long history of time where the federal government was completely, almost entirely, hands off when it came to policy and oversight of higher education. They got in the K-12 game somewhat earlier, um, but it wasn't really um, outside of a few kind of big things like the Morrill Act, otherwise known as the Land Grant Act, and the GI Bill. It wasn't to the, 50s, 60s, but really the 60s and then growing in the 70s that U.S. higher education or the U.S. government began to be really involved in U.S. higher education. Um, but the states had long been involved. Now, the level of engagement that you see um, as far as the level of engagement of the states in higher education relative to K-12 is far less. K-12, we've been far more comfortable in most states with heavier state oversight than we've seen in higher education. But that has ebbed and flowed. We have centralized our state higher education systems and decentralized. And currently we have some highly centralized models like in Georgia and North Carolina, and in a number of other states, and then heavily decentralized, almost no involvement like in Michigan, where you don't even have a SHIO agency. And we've seen some real regional and historical differences in the way that states fund public higher education. In the Northeast, they have largely, where they have a much stronger tradition of private higher education, they have taken a low state support, high tuition model to higher education, where their state appropriations per student are way below most other regions of the country, and their tuition rates tend to be quite a bit higher. So it's a more privatized approach to higher education. Out west, on the other hand, in most states, there's been a long tradition of lower tuition rates and generally higher state appropriations, although that hasn't really played out in Colorado in the last 20 years. And there's differences in the level of control that they have. In some states, the state controls tuition setting or gives institutions a range within which they can raise tuition. And in other states, they have no control over tuition. In some states, they operate generous need-based financial aid programs. In other states, they have large merit aid programs, and in some states, they have neither. And so there's a high degree of variance. We would say that each state is a laboratory unto itself, which is great for researchers because you never have any shortage of state policy questions. Another thing we've seen recently is the return of performance-based funding at the state level. That is something that's gone through ebbs and flows. It was really popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, fell out of favor. Many states abandoned their programs, and now it's come back with what some might say a vengeance. And we see over probably 30 states that operate performance-based funding, where all or a portion of the state appropriation to institutions is driven off of performance metrics and the institution's performance on those metrics. And so state policy is a fascinating area. And theoretically, state policy is meant to address problems. And um, the challenge there is there are some proverbial problems that never go away, like college access, inequity, those things, quality in higher education, performance of institutions, those things we never seem as of yet to be able to solve them. So there are perennial problems that um, state policies, we'll see many different state policies crop up to address them, like free college now has become a more popular policy, starting particularly with the Tennessee model. Um, and then there are new problems, problems that are unique. And clearly, we are in the throes of an unanticipated crisis, a problem in higher education with the COVID crisis. And so it you can see it as some of the perennial problems are exacerbated and new problems are surfaced within this crisis. And so there are short-term policies or state responses that are required, like quickly approving programs moving entirely online, something that normally would go through a long bureaucratic approval process had to be accelerated, right? Um, but then there's going to be the longer term uh, policy responses to unique and challenging problems. And one of those is going to be a resource problem. And I know Colorado Mountain College is somewhat insulated from that with their local appropriations, but for many colleges, it's going to be a major problem. So, what is the response of the state, and what is the responsibility of the state? Um, and to what extent, over the longer term, can the states ensure that, one, they're ensuring quality, but also protecting students as we deal with the long-term implications of the rapid adoption of distance education, where many of the programs and professors had no intention of being either offering or being offered online and have no expertise in offering online distance education. And so, what are the long term state policy responses to that challenge? What about if students, if we find in the data that students frankly just did not learn the material in the way that they should have, or we see that many students didn't return to college, that they disattached from the institution and then never came back. If we have a generation that is, at least in part, left behind, a generation of students, that is. Um, what are the state policy solutions to that very unique, very critical policy problem? Um, and so, in today's or the readings for this week, you see that several, at least two of the articles hit on what were kind of potentially policy priorities. Some of that's just going to be thrown out the window, right? But we also see in Lingenfelter's chapter that it's not the first time we've seen a major disruption. Um, and we've seen higher education persevere through worldwide traumatic events like world wars, a Great Depression, and it'll persist through this crisis. It'll look different, um, somewhat, maybe more than somewhat. I don't know. But state policy is going to play a major role. And state higher education leaders will need to step up as advocates for higher education and as change agents within higher education, offering both nudges and pushes, but also support for institutions and students. It's a particularly challenging time to be in this work, but you shouldn't be in this work unless you're willing to step up in these kind of challenging times. In my opinion, anyways, it's a privilege to work in the field of higher education, and we should be there when things get tough. So I appreciate all of you being there, and your critical roles that you play within the Colorado Mountain College. And good luck. I can't wait to see you all a week from now. Best.